You are watching the Executive Branch e-lecture. This goes along with, in 2015, our week one area of study talking about the executive branch. The executive branch is far and away in America, at least the most visual of the three branches of government, the other two being the judicial branch and the legislative branch. As you see on the screen in front of you, Barack Obama is our current president, and the president is the head of the executive branch and the most visual representation of really any of the three branches, but especially the executive branch. So, the goal of this e lecture is to give you a basic understanding of the president's role within the executive branch. I also want you to try to get to understand the role of two other parts of the branch, the vice president and the cabinet positions, and then also start to understand some of the executive departments that exist in the executive branch and what kind of role they play in policy setting. I want to start kind of with a story though, because the executive branch is a great example of how what we think is going on is not always exactly what really is going on. What I mean by that is that everybody likes to give the president a lot of blame for things that go wrong. And then on the opposite end of that, the president, whoever it is, not just Democrats but Republicans as well, likes to take a lot of credit for what goes right. So at the end of a presidential term, whenever the president is trying to get elected to a second term, or whenever the president has completed a second term and is trying to ensure that another presidential candidate from his or her party is going to get elected, the president will say things like, "Oh, while I was in office, we created 4.2 million jobs," or "While I was in office, I ended the war with such and such country." And while either of those two statements may be true, it is so many more people other than the president who did anything. And the opposite of that is true as well. When opponents of the sitting president or opponents of a presidential candidate uh, give a single president blame for an issue, for example, President Obama is given a lot of blame for illegal immigration, and a lot of Republicans blame President Obama for weak illegal immigration policies and say that his policies are ruining the American economy. They're ruining the American job force, and that's why America is weakening as a superpower. Or they may say that healthcare is screwed up because President Obama forced through, like a dictator, the Affordable Care Act, which we all know as Obamacare. So again, the enemies of the president are giving a lot of blame to President Obama, when in reality, President Obama is just one of hundreds of thousands of people working on every single issue. So a lot, kind of like a coach in a sport, a lot of credit is given where it's probably not deserved, and when things go bad, a lot of blame is given when it's probably not deserved either. So, an overview of what we'll be looking at: the president, the vice president, the cabinet, and the executive departments and bureaucracy. Let's start with what you need to be president of the United States. There are a couple specific qualifications, and without these qualifications, you can't even enter an election. First off, you have to be 35 years old. Simple enough. The third one is simple enough. You have to have lived in the United States the last 14 years. So, for example, those of you getting ready to go to college, if you decide to study abroad and you say love it in Morocco, Africa, and you end up staying there for a significant period of time, then when you move back to the United States, you have to be in the United States for 14 years before you're eligible to run for president of the United States. That second one is an interesting. Must be a natural born citizen. That does include military base, and what that essentially means is that you must have been born on U.S. soil. There are all kinds of citizens. For example, my great great grandmother came to America from Greece. She came through Ellis Island, the famous island in New York City where lots of immigrants came through, and she was born in Greece. She was born in a city called Thessaloniki. She came to the United States, emigrated to the United States, and over the course of several years eventually gained her citizenship. But she's not a natural born citizen because she was born in Thessaloniki, Greece, not in the United States of America. So even if she wanted to, she could not have run to be president of the United States. Now, the opposite of that would be my dad. My dad, who several of you know, the voice of the Yellow Jackets, my dad was born on a military base in Tokyo, Japan. His dad served in the Air Force. His mom was living with him on the United States Air Force Base in Tokyo. And she gave birth to my dad in Tokyo. My dad lived on the U.S. military base for like the first 18 months of his life. Um, but when you're born on a U.S. military base, it's actually considered to be no different than if you're born in Kansas City, Missouri, or any other city within the United States. So even though my dad was born in Tokyo, Japan, because he was born in Tokyo, Japan on a U.S. military base, he could have run for president. Um, there's some conspiracy about this with President Obama. President Obama was born in Hawaii, um, but there were some people trying to say that his birth certificate was faked. And so if you're wondering what that whole spiel was about that you saw in 2008 and 2012, a lot of his enemies are trying to claim that President Obama did not satisfy that second natural born citizen requirement, therefore he couldn't legally run to be president of the United States. The Supreme Court actually ruled on this, and they said that he was born within the United States and he did have a valid birth certificate, and at least legally the problem went away, although there are still enemies of the president who like to say that he should not even legally be allowed to be president. Once you're elected to become president, pardon me, once you're elected to become president, um, you're in office for 4 years, no matter what, unless you are impeached, which is something we'll go over later. The president and the vice president are elected together, and that's an important change from how our country originally elected the president. Originally, there might be, let's say, 5 people running to be president of the United States. Let's say 2 were Democrats and 3 were Republicans. If the top vote getter was a Democrat and the second highest vote getter was a Republican, then the Democratic candidate would be the president and the Republican candidate would be the vice president. So when we originally started as a nation, we did not elect presidents and vice presidents together. We just had a presidential election, and the top 2 people getting the votes were elected to become president and vice president. Now that has changed, and the president and the vice president are elected together. They're put on the same ticket. So, for example, in 2012, President Obama ran for president, and on his ticket was Vice President Joe Biden. If President Obama won, which he did, then Joe Biden was the vice president. If President Obama lost, Joe Biden was not the vice president. And same goes with Mitt Romney and his vice president that went along with him. The term of the president is limited to 2 terms by the 22nd Amendment. There are 27 amendments overall. The 22nd limits the president to 2 terms, which gives you 8 years. Now, the reason that it says 10 years is kind of an interesting and gruesome uh, little exception to the rule. If a, if a president dies in office, the 25th Amendment passes the power on to the Vice President of the United States. So let's say that President Obama were to die today, August 16th, 2015. If that were to happen, then Vice President Joe Biden would become President of the United States, and he would stay President of the United States until January 20th, 2017, which is when this current president will switch over to the next president after the election. We'll talk about that and why it's January 20th a little bit later. So that is less than 2 years. That's about what we got 12, 4, 5, 17 months. 17 months and 4 days from today is how long Joe Biden would be president. Well, in order to count as a quote unquote term, and the 22nd Amendment limits the president to 2 terms, in order to count as a term, a president has to serve for at least 24 months, which is 2 years. So Vice President Joe Biden could serve from today until January 20th for 17 months and 4 days. And then, in theory, he could get elected to 2 more terms or 8 more years after that. So he could serve for 8 years plus 17 months and 4 days, which gives him a total of 9 years, 5 months, and 4 days. So the exception is in case of a president passing away and then the vice president taking power, and then the vice president running for 2 more terms on top of that. Being the president has a lot of good things that go with it. That we'll talk a lot about some of the negatives, such as assassination, not a very good thing, such as the incredibly hectic schedule that goes along with being president. But there are several good things, not least among which are all the perks that come along with being the president. So you can see on the page in front of you, the salary is nothing, really incredible if you're comparing it to some top executives in the United States and CEOs of companies, professional athletes, musicians, all make a lot more than the President of the United States. However, the President of the United States often has a really good speaking career after he retires. So, for example, President Bill Clinton, who served from 1992 to 2001, he now earns about $10 million per year speaking at colleges and universities and in front of businesses. So he only gets paid the pension, which is approximately 250,000 per year officially. However, he gets paid for the additional work that he does, that he gets hired out to do. Each year, the president gets $50,000 for expenses. The president actually pays for his and his family's own food, except when it's an official state dinner. And the president gets $100,000 for travel, although that does not count the use of Air Force One, which is a 777 Boeing jet, gigantic. And the president gets to use that jet at any time that he or she would like. The president also gets to live in the White House, which, besides being a very nice building, is a gigantic building and a technologically state of the art building with 132 rooms and a full set of offices for the president and his staff. The president also gets to use Camp David, which is a wooded resort. The president gets full medical and dental care for the rest of his life, and the president gets Secret Service protection for the rest of his life, as well as Secret Service protection for his family. The president needs that Secret Service protection because lots of people in the world and in America, unfortunately, would like to see a sitting president killed for various reasons. If that were to happen, that would be called an assassination. Assassinations have happened several times throughout the history of the United States. Abraham Lincoln was the first president to be assassinated in a movie theater. And then John F. Kennedy was also assassinated in the 60s. There have been several attempted assassinations. Gerald Ford survived an attempted assassination. And then nearly every president receives threats, most likely on a daily basis, although not all of them, and not even most of them, turn into an actual threat. Should a president pass away, and this could be from assassination or it could also just be from old age or disease. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is the longest serving president in United States history, served during World War II from, I believe, 1933 to 1945, so 12 years. He was in the middle of his fourth term in office when he got sick and he eventually died while he was in office. So, whether the president dies from sickness or from attack or murder, doesn't matter. If the president dies, the vice president is the next in line to take over. Now, it became apparent with the growing deadliness of weapons and bombs and larger explosives that there needed to be a plan just in case several top officials of the United States were killed at once. So the 25th Amendment, the 22nd Amendment lays down the Presidential Succession Act. As part of that amendment, the vice president takes power first. If the president and the vice president are killed simultaneously or killed before a new one is appointed, the Speaker of the House, which is the leader of the House of the Representatives for the majority party, so currently that's a Republican. Number three is the president pro tempore, who is actually not the elected leader, but just the oldest member of the majority party in the Senate. So currently that's a Democrat. So if President Obama, a Democrat, were to die, first in line is Vice President Biden, who is also a Democrat. Second in line is Speaker of the House Boehner, who is a Republican. And third in line is President pro tempore, and I don't even know that person off the top of my head, but they are a Democrat. After that, we have cabinet secretaries. There are 16 of them, and it goes in order of which departments were created first. So the Secretary of State was the first cabinet position ever created. So the Secretary of State, currently John Kerry, is the first person in line. Pardon me. The 25th Amendment that we just talked about sets up this line of succession. It also states that if the vice president were to be elevated to become president, then the vice president is to appoint a new vice president. So if Joe Biden were to become president because President Obama were to die, then Joe Biden would then appoint a new vice president to become second in line. The only catch there is that the United States Senate has to approve that appointment, just like they have to approve every other presidential appointment. Richard Nixon is an interesting example of the 25th Amendment. Elected in 1968 to his first term and second term in 1972, he had a very tumultuous president, which led to his resignation at the end. His first vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned due to income tax evasion, so he tried to get out of paying his taxes. Gerald Ford became the new VP. Nixon in 1974 got caught up in the Watergate scandal. We'll actually watch a movie on that scandal later in the year. And he eventually resigned when it became very clear that he was going to be taken down as part of the scandal and he was going to be impeached. He decided to resign before he could be impeached. So Gerald Ford, who was never elected by the United States people, became president of the United States just because he was appointed by Nixon when Spiro Agnew resigned. Ford appoints a guy named Nelson Rockefeller, one of the richest men in United States history. And in 1974, we have a new president vice president combo consisting of two men, neither of whom had been elected by the United States populace. Presidential politics have a huge role to play in Democratic and Republican parties. Those are the two main parties that exist currently in the United States, although it's not always been that way. In fact, the types of policies that we now think of as democratic or liberal or more progressive, back in the time of Abraham Lincoln in the mid 1800s, would have been called Republican. In fact, Abraham Lincoln called himself a Republican. And Abraham Lincoln, as you all know, was a key figure in dismantling the system of slavery in the United States and eventually pushing for a civil war to solve the problem of slavery in the United States. Currently, more race equality kind of positions tend to be more democratic liberal positions, and less progressive, less race equality positions tend to be Republican. So that's kind of flip flopped over the last 150 years or so. There are actually no parties listed in the Constitution, so these are created just uh, through the history of our nation. The first parties were the Federalists and the Republicans, also known as the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, federal means central government, so Federalists wanted a strong central government. Anti-Federalists or Republicans wanted a weak central government. They wanted more power to be in the states. We will look at the Federalist debates later in the semester and see what their main arguments were for why there should be a strong national government or why there should be a weak national government and a stronger state government. The election of 1800 is an interesting look at what goes on with presidential politics. Remember, at this time, presidents were not picked in a pair, they were picked by an individual. So John Adams uh, wanted Pinckney to be his vice president, and Thomas Jefferson wanted Adam Burr to be his vice president. Adams was a Federalist, Jefferson was a Republic. The electors ended up basically having a tie between Jefferson and Burr, who, remember, were both running together as Republicans, but at this time you couldn't run together. So these two men, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, who would like to be president and vice president together, are now in a situation where they are in a tie for the presidency, and it needs to be determined which of the two, even though Thomas Jefferson is who wanted to be the president, Aaron Burr wanted to be the vice president. It could turn out in this election that Aaron Burr would actually take over Thomas Jefferson's spot by getting more votes and could become the president himself. The House of Representatives gets to break a tie of a presidential election, so they got to vote, and they had to vote 35 times before they came to a decision. Uh, Alexander Hamilton, who was one of the great political masterminds of our early country, convinced the House of Representatives to vote for Jefferson causing him to become the third president. Aaron Burr became the vice president, and later Aaron Burr would eventually kill Alexander Hamilton in a shootout. So there were some obvious hard feelings between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Remember, Alexander Hamilton is the one who convinced the House to vote for Jefferson. There have been several changes to how we elect a president over the course of our history since 1776 and 1787 when our Constitution was put into place. The 12th Amendment, June 15th, 1804, got rid of the individual vote. So the conspiracy, the controversy that happened with the Jefferson Burr election in 1800 led to the 12th Amendment in 1804, stating that every candidate selects a running mate and the electors, the people, vote for the pair, not for the individual. We're going to look at electors here in just a second. Electors at the time, and even still today, mostly pledge to vote for a party. So you have Democratic electors and Republican electors, and you may have some independent electors. That's a smaller third party. And they may not particularly agree with a candidate, but for the most part, they will vote with the party. The 22nd Amendment in 1951 limited the president to 2 terms in office. This was because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, better known as FDR. He started serving as president of the United States before World War II. He was a wartime president. Remember, the United States joined the war in 1941. So when he started in 1933, with 2 terms, which is what the most that anybody had ever done up to this point in 1933. 2 terms would have gotten him to 1941. He had served his entire third term and was something like 50 days into his fourth term when he died of illness. So this is where you see the the exception that we were talking about. The vice president who took over for Franklin Delano Roosevelt was able to serve out the rest of the fourth term of FDR, which was almost the entire 4 years. It was more than 2 years, so it counted as one of his terms in office. One of the big misconceptions about our government system is that the people elect the president, and they actually don't. This is one of the frustrations that a lot of people have, and it's one of the big arguments of political reform, is that the presidential election should turn into a popular vote, and whoever wins the most votes becomes president. Now, having said that, that's usually how it goes. The most recent exception was 2000 when George W. Bush won the Electoral College and Al Gore won the popular vote. But because George Bush won the Electoral College, he became president of the United States with fewer total votes than Al Gore had. That was a very, very close election. Most elections don't end up being that close. Pardon me. The Electoral College is determined based on 2 factors. The first is the number of senators that a state has, and the second is the number of representatives that a state has. So every single state in the union, all 50, have 2 senators. So every state has at least two, and then every state in the union has at least one representative. The representatives are based on population. Therefore, every single state has at least three. 2 plus 1 gives you three. Some states, the larger ones, such as California in the most recent election had, I believe, 55 electoral votes with their 2 senators and then 53 representatives in the House. So larger states get more of a say. So that's why when you're watching the 2016 election, you will hear a lot about Florida because Florida is a very large, populous state, and it's also a state that doesn't always go Republican or always go Democrat. Now, that's an important part because Texas is a really big state as well. But Texas almost always votes for the Republican candidate no matter who it is. California is the same way except for the Democrats. So California nearly always votes for the Democratic candidate. So therefore, if you're a Republican running for president, you won't spend a lot of time in California because you can almost guarantee that you're going to lose that state, and there's no benefit to winning a small portion of that state. Even if you win 49% of the state, all 55 electoral votes go to the other candidate. So it's a winner takes all system. It's a very, very interesting system that we'll study quite a bit this year. The 23rd Amendment included the District of Columbia in the Electoral College, which was a big deal at the time because the District of Columbia had a lot of black voters and they felt like they were being excluded based on their race. And there's probably quite a bit of truth to that. So this was a big civil rights win in 1961 to give the District of Columbia three electors, even though they are not technically a state and they're not even technically a part of any state, even though they're surrounded by Maryland and Virginia. So we have a total of 435 representatives, 100 senators, plus three in the District of Columbia. That gives us a total of 538 elector votes. If you divide that by two, you get 269. So, in order to win the presidency, someone has to get 270 votes. In the past many elections, I believe it's back since the 30s was the last time that there was a presidential election where more than two candidates received electoral votes. So, for example, in 2012, Obama received electoral votes, Mitt Romney received electoral votes. There was a third party candidate who was an independent who got a lot of votes, but he did not win any states, so he didn't receive any electoral votes. Let's look at a map of the 2012 election. If we look at this map and we can blow it up a little bit bigger here. There we go. We can see President Obama and Biden in the blue states and Mitt Romney and Ryan in the red states. And then we see some undivided. This was a predictive one. So you can see President Obama and Joe Biden had a pretty good handle on 201 electoral votes even before the toss-up states. You can see Florida's a toss-up state. Wisconsin, Iowa, Nevada, Colorado, Ohio's a big toss-up state. All of these toss-up states, it wasn't clear whether they were going to vote for Obama Biden or Romney Ryan. But even before those, the race was pretty close. 201 for Obama Biden, 191 for Romney Ryan. Let's look at the eventual results, and we can see that of those toss-up states, nearly every single one eventually went to Barack Obama and Joe Biden. Remember in the previous slide, Obama Biden were at 201. They now are at 332. Romney Ryan were at 191, and they've only jumped up to 206. So of those toss-up states, Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Iowa, Nevada, Colorado, those were all toss-up states in the previous map, and they all are blue in this map that shows what eventually happened. So Obama and Biden in 2012 did a great job of winning those toss-up states. The president has several very important powers, some of which are listed in the Constitution. These are called enumerated powers, and some of which are not listed in the Constitution. These are called interpretive powers. So, some of the powers that are in the Constitution. The president is considered the commander in chief of the armed forces. That includes the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, and the Coast Guard. Even if the president never served in the military, so that's President Obama, he is still the commander in chief of the armed forces. The president also has the power to grant reprieves and pardons for federal offenses, so that means that the president is allowed to excuse prison terms or excuse fines given down by a federal court. President Obama used this power just several weeks ago to let out several drug offenders who were in for relatively light drugs. It wasn't, heroin or cocaine or any of the kind of heavy drugs. They were just in for marijuana. And so President Obama reprieved several sentences. I believe it was 47 individuals who he let free from prison. Um, and I believe he brought them all to the White House and encouraged them to use their second chance well. It was a pretty cool thing. Third is the president has the power to call a special session of Congress. Congress meets at various times throughout the year, and they get breaks throughout the year to go back to their home states and home cities to work with and listen to their voters. But the president has the power to require that they come back to Washington, D.C. and meet over a certain issue. The president also has the power, and some would say the privilege, to receive ambassadors from other nations. Every nation that the United States has relations with sends ambassadors to the United States and it is the president's job to meet with those ambassadors and to try to deal with issues that come up between the two nations. The president also has the power to execute laws, not to make laws, but to execute them. So, for example, the legislative branch actually made the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. The president, with the help of Health and Human Services, at that time Secretary Kathleen Sebelius, put that law into effect with things like creating the website and the online forms where that would actually happen. Now, if you remember, the rollout of Obamacare kind of sucked, and the website didn't work well right away. There were a lot of kinks and a lot of mistakes. So the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Sebelius, she was actually fired pretty soon after the Affordable Care Act was put into place because there was a lot of public pressure forcing Obama to fire her because they didn't feel that she executed the law very well. Finally, the president has power to appoint officials to lesser offices. This would include a new vice president if the vice president were to pass away. This also includes judges throughout the United States. The president shares two main powers with the Senate. The first is to make treaties. You've been reading about an arms deal with Iran recently, and that is a very interesting case of how the president and the Senate are interacting and sometimes not interacting very well to create a treaty with another nation. The president also has the power to appoint ambassadors, judges, and high officials. However, the Senate has the power to approve every one of those appointments. So let's say President Obama thought that I was really awesome and appointed me to be ambassador to Greece because I'm Greek. The Senate might call me into Washington, D.C. for an interview, and they may say, Mr. Chambers, do you speak Greek? And I may say, no, but I'm going to try really hard to learn. And they may say, this may not be a bad idea for our representative of the United States government to go to Greece and not even speak the language of Greece. And they might not approve my appointment, and they'd reject me and send the appointment back to the president and say, you need to pick somebody probably who speaks Greek to go live in Greece. The president has the power to approve legislation along with Congress. We'll study this a lot in the legislative branch, but the basics of it are that the legislative branch creates laws and the president must approve laws. If the president does not approve laws, the president vetoes the law. However, Congress has the power to override a veto by voting with two-thirds of the members of Congress to override that veto. It's relatively rare for a veto to be overridden, and we'll talk about why that is when we go over the legislative branch. In this slide, you see the cabinet members for the president. The cabinet is a group that is appointed by the president and again approved by the Senate, and they are in place to advise the president on more specific details. So, for example, President Obama has never been in the military. So, of these cabinet members, President Obama is going to lean pretty heavily on the Secretary of Defense, who has a larger area of expertise in the military. President Obama, when deciding what to do with a military situation, might call the Secretary of Defense into his office, or might call him on the phone, or might go meet with him and lay down a set of scenarios and ask for some advice on which one makes the most sense. Likewise, with farming, Secretary of Agriculture would have expertise there. So each of these individual secretaries has an area of expertise that they are set to guide the president on. The Oval Office is the office of the President of the United States. There are some fascinating stories that you'll hear about this room throughout the year, and you'll see a full-scale recreation when we go to the Truman Library in Independence later this year. The actual building of the White House is a very, very old but very secure and very up-to-date technological building. The infrastructure is updated constantly. So within the White House, you have the West Wing, which is where the offices of the Chief of Staff, the Press Secretary, and the Secret Service are. If we look at a map of where all this is, you can see number 4 is in front of the White House. That's where you see the Rose Garden and the famous fountain in front of the White House. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, the West Wing is on the left side, so you see the little area of the building in orange. If you go to Washington, D.C., and you get a tour of the White House, which you can get for free, that you will not be touring through the West Wing. You will tour through the East Wing of the White House. The only part that I really want to point out here, if you want to pause it and look through this, feel free to. But the only part I want to point out is number 6 down at the bottom that is shaped like an oval. That's the Oval Office that we just showed you a picture of. The last slide in this presentation is how a president is removed from office. The most common way is to lose an election, and that is generally how a president is removed from office. Outside of death, either accidental or uh, by assassination or health issues, the only way to remove a president of the United States is for that president to be impeached. And this is an act of the legislative branch using both houses, the House and the Senate, to remove the president. The House of Representatives, the 435 member body, has to vote on something called the Articles of Impeachment. The Articles of Impeachment are a document meant to declare what exactly the president has done wrong, what law or laws has the president broken, and what proof it might be given to prove that those laws have been broken. The House is allowed to vote on the articles of impeachment without a lot of proof that wrongdoing has been done. So, the articles of impeachment have sometimes in history been used as a political tool just to give the president bad press. The second part of the process goes to the Senate, and this is where this gets to be more like a court case, like a trial. Once the House votes on the articles of impeachment, the Senate conducts an actual trial to determine whether the president is guilty, and if the president is guilty, what punishment should ensue. So, in theory, a president could be impeached, and a president could be found guilty, and a president might not be removed from office even after being impeached and found guilty. The punishment might be a monetary fine. The punishment might be giving up part of his salary for the remainder of his time in office. There are several punishments that could be levied besides being removed from office. There have only been 3 impeachments in United States history. The first was Andrew Jackson in 1868, and you should go make fun of Mr. Jackson for having the same name. He was acquitted, though, by the Senate hearing. Same with Bill Clinton in 1998. He was acquitted by the Senate hearing. He was found to be guilty of cheating on his wife, most likely, but that is not a federal crime. It's not worth removing a president from office. Richard Nixon was close to being impeached. He was not ever actually impeached. So I actually misspoke. Only 2 impeachments. There was a third one coming with Nixon, but he was not ever actually impeached. Had he been impeached, it is very, very likely that he would have been found guilty of conspiracy to spy and use equipment against his political enemies. It's very likely that he would have been removed from the presidency, but we'll never know because President Nixon resigned the presidency before the full House could vote on the articles of impeachment. So that's all we've got for the executive branch. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in contact with me by email or by phone or just drop by class and we can talk about any questions you've got. Don't forget to complete your guided notes to go along with this e-lecture and to study for your test at the end of the week.